All right, welcome back to US History. We are still in Unit 6, but I'm going to call these videos the Civil War videos. Um, we will have two Civil War videos. So, let's get started. We need to start with the causes of the Civil War. So the war between the North and the South has been called many different names, and probably the two most common are the Civil War and the War between the states. So Northern sympathizers sometimes call it the War of the Rebellion or the War against Slavery. Southerners often call it the War of Southern Independence or the War of Northern Aggression. However, many other names have also been used. So people then and now disagree on what to call the war as well as the causes of it. But we are just going to call it the Civil War for our purposes in class. So in the fight, both sides demonstrated remarkable courage. The Southern soldier heroically fought in the face of overwhelming odds. The Northern soldier pursued victory in the face of devastating casualties. The war produced more than courage, however. The bitterness of a war in which countrymen killed each other had far-reaching consequences. The war that swept America forever changed the face of its people and its politics. Issues that should have been handled with ballots were settled with bullets, and as one historian has starkly observed, when the war was over, slavery was dead, secession was dead, and 600,000 men were dead. So, this is probably one of the most pivotal moments in American history. So a number of complex competing forces converged and clashed to produce the bloodiest chapter in America's history. The central issue that sparked the Civil War concerned the nature of the Union, like all the states being in a bond together. Could states that voluntarily join the Union by ratifying the Constitution voluntarily leave the Union? That was the major question. The issue had been hotly debated since the earliest years of the Republic, and during the War of 1812, as we saw, opposition to the war created strong secessionist sentiments among some disgruntled Federalists in New England. And after 1830, the growing sensation of frustration over the South's minority role in Congress renewed this tension. In fact, an open constitutional question at the time was do the states have the right to succeed? The fact that the succession question was a central cause of the war was underscored by Congress. The war resolution um, approved in the House of Reps by an overwhelming majority on July 25th, 1861, stated this: in this national emergency, this war is not waged in any spirit of oppression or for any purpose of conquest or subjugation, or of overthrowing or interfering with the rights or established institution of these states, but to defend and maintain the supremacy of the Constitution, and to preserve the Union, and with all the dignity, equality, and rights, and that as soon as these objectives are accomplished, the war ought to cease. So many Southern leaders asserted the constitutional right of succession based on state sovereignty. They said, according to the states' rights view, each state was largely independent and had joined a voluntary compact of the Union, but a union in which they maintained their identity and were not subordinate to a centralized national authority. And many Northern leaders insisted that secession was unconstitutional. They believed that when the states ratified the Constitution, they had surrendered state sovereignty. And they believed that Article 6 of that document made that clear. Thus, the war opens with a constitutional question and countercharges of that statesmen have wrestled with throughout the decades. So the North argued that the Union must be preserved above all else, and the South argued that the rights and liberties of the states must be preserved, even at the expense of the Union. So, the war resolution in the House of 1861, please make sure that you know that document. It says that the North's goal was to maintain the supremacy of the Constitution. So one is our first cause. Oop, sorry. Our first cause is union versus succession, and our second cause is economics. Economic differences between the North and the South also played a pretty big role in this war. The foundation of the Northern economy was industry and manufacturing, whereas the Southern economy was agriculture, specifically cotton production. They also did sugar, rice, tobacco, and hemp and other crops. So the South produced these raw materials and then would ship them to the Northern factories as well as to foreign countries. And so it tied a lot of their agriculture economy to the practice of slavery. And one of the often overlooked contributing factors to the war was the tariff, this tax, right? The tax on imported goods. The North favored a high tax on imported goods, a tariff. The North favored a high tariff, not as a source of revenue, even though it was for the government, but as a means to protect its industries from foreign imports so that Americans would buy things in America. Um, the South opposed the high tariff because it had little industry. And so foreign imports and trade supported their economy. So a high tariff hurt trade and made foreign products more expensive. So Southerners believed that they were, in effect, being forced to pay the tariff to support Northern industry. So you can see why that was a point of contention. Our third thing is slavery. Now, slavery was an integral part of the Southern culture. A major reason Southern states succeeded was that many leaders there did not believe Lincoln's assurances that they would not interfere in their way of life, which depended on slavery. The Southern farming economy relied heavily on slave labor. Thus, slavery played an important role in their decision to go to war. In the North, abolitionists had made gradual gains in public opinion, at least in opposition to the expansion of slavery. And of course, racial prejudice in the North and fear that freeing slaves would cause many slaves to move north and compete for their jobs made many Northerners actually indifferent to the plight of African Americans in bondage. But nonetheless, the moral problem was difficult to ignore. There is an obvious contradiction between the proposition that all men are created equal and the institution of slavery. Only about one quarter of Southern families owned slaves. However, by the time of the Civil War, many Southerners, even those who did not own slaves, argued that slavery was good. So some even insisted that the Southern slave culture cultivated the virtues of honor and courage and duty and dignity. Um, so Northern opposition to slavery was seen as an interference with the core of Southern society. Um, Let me see where else I want to take us. Now we know, I think I want to back up to remember our compromises in the Constitutional Convention. And there was the Commerce Compromise that said that slavery would end in the 1830s. Um, well, when that year came around, which it did, they did hold true to the compromise. But here is the kicker. The international slave trade ended. So now in the 1830s, which is about 30 years before the Civil War, America stops buying slaves internationally, like straight from Africa and other places. But that wasn't the whole of slavery. And in fact, plantation owners just pivoted when the international trade shut down and they formulated an, a domestic slave trade. And so at that point, they encouraged slaves to get married. They wanted, they would sell slaves to and from different states. And so then they actually increased in value because there was no longer an international trade, but only a domestic trade. So the price of a slave person went up, and then they bought and sold them amongst the different farms and everything. So even though that we had the Commerce Compromise and it did end international slavery, coming to America, it did not stop domestic trade, and domestic trade, unfortunately, flourished. So that's how slavery still continued even with the Commerce Compromise. Now, we know that the Bible does not endorse slavery. Um, I'll have some passages in our next lesson that address slavery in the Bible and what the Lord says about it. But we recognize that all people are made in God's image, and um, that is who we are accountable to, is God alone. So we will get back to that, the moral component of slavery, in our next lesson. But I just wanted to kind of touch base on there if you were remembering the Commerce Compromise. So let's move on. Oh, there was one more thing I wanted. I'm so sorry. There's one more thing here. Do you see how our third issue here, slavery, connects with the other two issues we talked about, economics as well as union versus succession? So, why was the South all up in arms about states' rights and liberties, that they want things they wanted to do? Because they wanted to continue in the slave trade. Why was their economics such a big point of contention? Because it was cotton production in which they used the slave trade. So it is safe to say that out of all these three major reasons that the Civil War started, the first two stem from slavery. So you can't say that it wasn't about slavery and that it was about other issues, because those other issues are connected. They are stemming from the moral issue of slavery. All right. So just something to point out there. Now we need to look at the critical factors of the war, like who had what. So we're going to take some time here to compare the North and the South. So behind the massing armies of the North and the South were a number of sectional differences that would prove to be critical factors over the course of the war. First, we need to talk resources. In terms of the most basic resources of population, food production, and industrial output, the North had the advantage in every area. The 18 northern states had a population of 22 million, and that's more than twice of what the 11 succeeding states had. Um, so, Napoleon once remarked that an army marches on its stomach, and in this regard, the Northern Army marched farther. The agriculture of the South, in terms of volume, was geared towards cash crops like cotton and tobacco, which would do little to sustain hungry troops. The North's Midwest region dominated production of wheat, corn, and oats. So the two regions, however, were more balanced in their numbers of livestock. So grains, north winds, livestock, about equal. So there was a sharp difference that existed between the sections over manufacturing ability. The North had 5 times the number of factories and 10 times the number of industrial workers. The North also had uh, twice the railroad mileage of the South and the capacity to produce more. So it is actually pretty impressive when you think back to it that the South lasted for 4 years, considering what they were up against when it came to resources. We need to talk leadership. One area in which the South surpassed the North in really the early years of the war was military leadership. The South had a strong military tradition, and many Southerners had attended West Point, the National Military Academy. And as a result, many of the Confederate officers were better trained than their Union counterparts at the outset of the war. And this command difference was particularly pronounced in the Eastern campaigns, where Robert E. Lee, uh, Stonewall Jackson, and J.E.B. Stuart displayed brilliance and resourcefulness that often bewildered their opponents. Other leaders, despite being untrained, also proved their worth militarily as well in the South. So that was an advantage of the South. When it came to strategy, the two sides also differed a lot in their strategies for winning the war. The North would have to invade the South and defeat the Southern armies on the battlefield. General Winfield Scott, commander of the Union Army at the beginning of the war, devised a plan. First, he proposed a blockade of southern ports to make it difficult for the Confederacy to get supplies. And then, second, he said we need to control the Mississippi River. So, control the ocean ports and then control the river. And this would split the Confederacy up and hamper its ability to move men and supplies west and east. So this whole plan we call the Anaconda Plan, and it's named after the large South American snake that, slowly crushes its prey with its coils. So Scott's ideas and thoughts were eventually both realistic and successful. And later that strategy was modified to include two additional goals. The third goal was to divide and conquer the Southern Heartland, and then also fourth, to capture the Confederate capital, which was Richmond, Virginia. So that's the North strategy, the Anaconda Plan, focusing on the water ports. The Confederate strategy was largely defensive, and it was to outlast the enemy's will to fight. And in general, the Southern soldiers took up arms for the compelling reasons that he was fighting to protect home and family from invading force, which over the long term provided a sustaining motivation in the face of death and hardship. Defending the home front strengthened the will to fight, but the strategy risked Southern devastation by attacking forces. So, we're going to give military defensive strategy to the south, and then invasion and siege military strategy to the north. So now we're going to go through and we're just going to do some snapshots of the biggest battles. And these should feel familiar from our Civil War reenactment D&D game. Most of those battles coincide and go together. So you've already had a review of all these battles, and now I'm giving you the details. So we're going to get through the war in the East, and then we're going to call it good today. So the contest in the East fought largely in Virginia, and it centered on the North's attempt to defeat the Confederate Army and capture the new capital at Richmond, Virginia. So the Confederate government's move from Montgomery, Alabama to Richmond linked the success of the Confederacy to the fortunes of the state that would contribute the most to the cause. So on to Richmond was the battle cry that characterized much of the Union's strategy. However, Richmond had capable and courageous defenders that would end up forcing the Union Army into a long and costly campaign. So, in the spring of 1861, in both the North and the South, most people believed that this would relatively be a quick and decisive war battle, um, and it was going to be held somewhere between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, and that would be it. So Lincoln's initial call for troops in April was for an enlistment of 3 months. These summer soldiers, like their Southern counterparts, were eager for fame and fighting, and they would soon get the chance to prove themselves at a little Virginia crossroads called Manassas Junction. And that is where we have the first major battle of the war, the first Battle of Bull Run in July 1861. So, with the Northern press clamoring for something to write about and the 3 month enlistments nearing an end for about 80,000 troops, Lincoln felt pressure to take the offensive. General Irvin McDowell, who was the field commander of the Union or Northern forces, was ordered south to take Richmond. And on July 18th, McDowell's troops encountered the Confederate forces under General Beauregard near Manassas Junction, and it was right at a railroad intersection, um, and it's about 25 miles south of Washington, D.C. So in Washington, news of the massing armies was the talk of the town, and there was hundreds of spectators, from senators to socialites, who turned out in all their fancy clothes and picnic baskets, and they were up on the hills ready to watch the battle. Like, how twisted is this? Um, so after arriving from the frontline festivities, uh, a congressman, John Logan, he decided to join the troops, and he went into battle wearing a top hat and a tuxedo. Like, this was crazy. Like, no one realized what they were getting into. The Confederates chose to take a stand at a little stream near Manassas called Bull Run. And on Sunday morning, July 21st, McDowell launched his attack, the Northern guy. And at first, the raw Union troops did well, pushing back the equally raw Confederate troops. However, the timely arrival of troops from the South Carolinian and Virginian, Bernard B. and Thomas J. Jackson stemmed the tide, and facing heavy fire and repeated assaults, the South's troops were about to retreat. But B. Bernard B. galloped among his troops and urged them to hold the line, reportedly pointing to Jackson's brigade and shouting, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall! Rally behind the Virginians!" And the name stuck. And Jackson was thereafter known as Stonewall Jackson. And it was all because of Bernard B. Um, so the end of the battle, the Confederates won the battle, and they're also going to win the second Battle of Bull Run. Lincoln is so discouraged by this first big loss that he actually replaces McDowell with George McClellan. And um, so the most significant result was that both sides were beginning to realize that the war would not be over quickly. Members of Congress, some of who had attended the Sunday afternoon picnic near Bull Run, voted for 500,000 more troops for a 3-year enlistment. And the season for summer soldiers was past. All right, guys, that's where we'll pick up next time. I hope you guys have a great day. Make sure you fill in your notes with this. All right, bye.